everybody. Welcome back. I hope everybody had a nice lunch break. My name is Laurie Nadolny, and I'm the Deputy Director in the Office of Scientific Investigations, which is within FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And I'm going to be moderating the third session today. We're going to be discussing translating QbD principles to risk-proportionate oversight, including risk-based monitoring. This morning, really, we were just talking about set the stage really well for this session. You know, first we heard a little bit about the regulatory perspective, which not only supports but really encourages QbD in taking a risk-proportionate approach to study design and conduct. And then the last session, of course, focused really on QbD approach to designing quality into study protocols and operations, including identifying critical to quality factors and evaluating and managing risks at the design phase, largely. So this session, we're going to sort of move into implementation and how do we monitor risks that cannot be designed away. So we're going to focus on the uptake of risk-based monitoring approaches, as well as identifying some successes and challenges with implementing a risk-based approach to clinical trial monitoring and sponsor oversight of trial-related activities that are performed by third-party providers. Similar to previous sessions, you're going to hear from a really broad range of expert stakeholders, each of whom are going to share some concrete examples of RBM implementation. And again, we're going to hear about successes and challenges. We'll start with 3 presentations, followed by, I hope, plenty of time for panel discussion. So our first presentation is going to be from Nicole Stansbury. And Nicole is the Senior Vice President and Global Head of Clinical Operations at Premier Research. Prior to joining Premier, Nicole spent over 25 years in the CRO industry, served a number of positions, including Global Head of Central Monitoring and Head of Global Clinical Performance, so very well suited for this session. She served as co-lead for the Association of Clinical Research Organizations Risk-Based Monitoring Working Group since 2014, and she's going to be primarily presenting on ACRO's most recent RBM implementation findings. Following Nicole's presentation, we're going to hear from Patrick Nadolny. And Patrick is the Global Head of Clinical Data Management at Sanofi, also the Chair of the Board of the Society for Clinical Data Management. Again, over 30 years of experience across industry, and for the last 10 years or more, focusing really on RBM, as well as having an interest in technology and change management. And this ties in really well to his presentation, where he's going to focus some on ensuring data quality during disruptions. And then finally, we're going to hear from Michael Walega, who will present on some of the recent work from the PHUSE Risk-Based Quality Management Working Group, which Michael co-leads. In addition to his role in PHUSE, Michael has a wealth of experience in RBM. He's the head of the centralized monitoring at Bristol Myers Squibb, where he, among other things, champions risk-based quality management approaches to clinical trial monitoring activities. Following those presentations, we'll have some brief opening remarks and some reflections from our final 2 panelists, Steve Young and Kristin Stallcup. Steve is the Chief Scientific Officer at CluePoints, where he oversees research and development of advanced methods for data analytics, data surveillance, and risk management, along with providing guidance to customers in RBQM, methodology, and best practices. And Kristin is a subject matter expert in risk-based quality management and co-leads the RBQM operations team at Takeda. So a wealth of experience and expertise in this panel, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. So first, I'll turn it over to you, Nicole.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm excited to be able to represent ACRO. For those of you that don't know, ACRO is the Association of Clinical Research Organizations. We are made up of CROs and technology companies to advocate policymakers and others for clinical trial operations and innovations. We've been a part of a number of different initiatives over the years, and one in particular that I'll be talking to you about today is our RBM landscape survey. This landscape survey was conducted over the last 4 years. We'll be initiating the 5th year this year. And we really look at some components of that landscape survey to see which components of risk-based monitoring have been adopted. We are using data from 7 to 4 different CROs, and it encompasses anywhere from 4,000 studies to over 6,000 studies over the years. You can see, based on this data, we're looking at some of the efficiencies and some of the opportunities for improving RBQM and monitoring in general through these practices. The risk assessment is probably the most well-adopted component, but what you can see by the survey is that the other components are just not as well adopted. There's not a lot of pull-through, so we do a lot of work to do a risk assessment, and then the benefit of that risk assessment is not pulling through the other components. So today, I'm going to really focus on 2 components within the survey that are lagging behind. One is central monitoring. It was mentioned briefly this morning, the benefits of central monitoring. And then the other part is reduced SDR and SDV. And together, we think that the combination of central monitoring and reducing SDR and SDV can help to bring value to our clinical trials, not only from a cost efficiency standpoint, but in looking at how we monitor data today compared to more traditional monitoring practices. So this is an example of really the benefit of central monitoring. So if you think about monitoring in general, the gold standard has been sending CRAs out to site and having them perform 100% review of all of the data, so 100% SDR and SDV of the data. And that was the gold standard, and that worked well when EDC or paper CRFs were the only source of data. It also probably worked moderately well when we were talking about maybe 100,000 to 500,000 data points in a study. But as Ken pointed out this morning, we're looking at over 3.5 million data points in a trial. Oncology studies can be 6 million data points in a trial. And it is not just one source of data anymore. It is multiple sources of data. There is no way traditional monitoring can accomplish and even be the gold standard anymore in doing 100% SDR and SDV. Not to mention the fact that the SDV box that we all talk about checking and measuring and monitoring, that only exists and resides within an EDC platform, not in all the other data sources. So in order for us to really be thorough and look across our monitoring, we've got to adapt different monitoring methodologies. And central monitoring is a key component of that. When we talk about aggregating data, I think this slide represents that data aggregation well, where a CRA or even an investigator can see one piece of data coming in for a patient at a time across multiple different sources of data. By aggregating data, we can layer that together. And even at a patient level, it is a better way of monitoring data. Not to mention, at a protocol level, being able to see how that data across all the sites is trending and identify outliers. So I think this is an important point to think about how we utilize and adopt central monitoring at a greater scale. The next thing that I want to talk about are just some different methods. We've talked a lot this morning about it's not one size fits all. It really is fit for purpose. And I would encourage anyone that is looking to deploy a central monitoring or a reduced SDR and SDV strategy to not be limited in thinking about just one solution for your organization. Each trial is going to require different pieces. And you can see by this slide, there are different components of a central monitoring strategy. It might be QTLs in some studies, but not in others. KRIs might work well across all studies. Patient-level data review works really well in even the tiniest trials with only a few patients, where study-level central monitoring may work in very large trials. And in most trials, a combination of all of these is the right solution. to provide that safety and data integrity that we're looking for patients and trial integrity. Same thing goes with SDR and SDV sampling. It's different strategies depending on the volume of data. If you want to look at critical data, and critical process is another key component of that. So if we just decide to go down the path of a data point sampling methodology, we might lose focus and not pay attention to some of the more critical processes that are occurring on that trial. Where if we looked at different ways of sampling data and reducing SDR and SDV by different strategies, either a patient-level sampling strategy might work well in large vaccine trials, or a patient visit sampling strategy, or in many cases, a combination of multiple strategies. So these slides are meant to really help continue to push the drive forward, to give you options and ideas, show you different strategies to take. And this is another slide to indicate some of the benefits. So if you're trying to drive these forward within your organization, want to make these tools available for you to help push those forward. And the last slide here is really keys to RBM oversight, making sure that if you are a sponsor and you're trying to oversee your CRO in particular's implementation of RBM, make sure that you know what their processes are. Make sure that there's good communication and collaboration. I think someone said earlier today, it's one thing if you come up with all the risks, but then how are you actioning those? And what happened at the end? So making sure that those connections are there. I think another key component as you're looking at developing a risk-based monitoring strategy that works is making sure in your outsourcing strategy that you're taking into consideration how different companies compact that central monitoring strategy in a different way. Some pieces reside within a data management function, some pieces reside within a clinical function, and if you take those parts and pieces and put them together in a different way, you may not get the same outcome. So just be cognizant of the choices you're making from an outsourcing perspective to make sure that you're not breaking some of those pieces that are designed to work well and fit together. And the last thing I think that has been covered a couple of times today is talking about absence of errors that matter. So when you're deploying a risk-based monitoring strategy and you're using central monitoring or SDR and SDV sampling strategies, inevitably, we are still going to miss some things. It is critical that instead of reverting back to 100% SDR and SDV and having remonitoring out in the field again, that we really take a careful, pragmatic approach to investigating those errors that can still continue to happen. Engage with your statisticians to find out, does this impact the integrity of the trial? Engage with your medics. Is this truly a significant patient safety issue? And if not, let's agree not to go to death by kappa and allow us to really continue to focus on the things that matter. And I'll pass it on to
Yeah, we're going to pass it to Patrick. Thank you very much, Nicole. I think the uptake of risk assessment, initial and ongoing risk assessment is encouraging, but there's still a lag in terms of implementation of those risk-based monitoring strategies. So something I think maybe we can delve into a little more during discussion. But
absolutely.
I'll first turn it over to Patrick.
Hi, everybody. So first, thank you to Duke Margolis and FDA for inviting me, for giving a voice to clinical data management. It does not happen every day. So and few people know how passionate I am about clinical data management. And something you said, Ken, earlier resonated very well is one of the roadblocks in adopting RBQM is it's too generic. So we need training material for specific functions. And if you're a data manager and you read ICH E6, E8, you may not understand what it means and how to apply it in your current job. So if we don't have training specific to a function or demystify, it will not work. And that's why at SCDM, we published a paper on risk-based clinical data management for that reason, because clinical data management is different than clinical operations. And That paper includes the content of ICH E8 on what quality by design mean for a clinical data manager specifically. So to me, maybe odd topic. So you may think that it is odd to see quality by design on description in one slide. On some extent, the title is not meant to be provocative. It's really, can quality by design and description coexist? My answer is yes, yes, and yes, and I have no doubt about it. And I hope at the end of my talk you will be convinced as well. So, but before I dive into how to ensure data quality, let's make sure we have the basis well understood for everybody. So, I like to refer back to ICH E8 on is what you said, Mock, earlier on. It's about culture. It's not just about process. On ICH E8 has a specific area or section about culture. It's really changing the culture. It's not just about a process. Critical thinking, very important. And we have to remember, we come from a QC world. Data management used to generate queries, doing data entry, monitor SDV, point by point. And it's a big mindset change. And changing the mindset of the culture is extremely complicated. So that's very, and it does need to not be underestimated. So applying risk-based approaches, surprisingly, it's easier in a context of disruption than it is on a regular process. Context, we discussed earlier on when COVID hit, we had no choice. DCT was the only avenue. We all ran and made it happen. COVID is gone, and what we are seeing is a slower adoption of DCT. My take on it is it's a risk profile and risk ratio. At the time of COVID, it was higher risk to do nothing instead of applying DCT. Today, technology is not there. The costs are high. The risk profile of DCT is not as appealing as it used to be. And now we are in an uphill battle to make it happen at a larger scale. Critical thinking, one size fits all. Again, if you think about crisis management, the COVID crisis is totally different from the war in Ukraine, right? So one size fits all does not work. And if you think about the COVID and the war in Ukraine, you don't know the end. It's evolving by the hour, by the day, by the month. So what you start with is not what you end up with. So you need to constantly adapt, evaluate the risk, and continue evolving along the way. On the next slide, I'm really approaching my talk on the operational side, and I'm not repeating the discussion we had about protocol simplification and risk assessment at the beginning, necessarily. But I think one big thing is QbD is about risk assessment, but it's also quality process by design. We do risk assessment because we have known risk, but if the process was more robust to start with, we would not have as many risks in the risk assessment. And what we're seeing with the complexification of drug development, being DCT, being now utilizing AI, we have more complex protocol, basket, umbrella, platform, etc. Our world is not getting any simpler. So when we do a risk assessment using RACT, which is not very telling to some of the data manager folks, you look at the risk, some risks are known. Like if you have an umbrella design with different routes of administration, the fact that you have multiple routes of administration can lead into potential unblinding. If you use DCT, I'm not going to go through all the examples. If you use DCT and you collect data in home nursing, telemedicine, etc., you have a variety of ways of collecting data. You create a data silos, and it's almost impossible for the investigator to oversee a patient. If you have one piece of the data in telemedicine, one piece in EDC, one piece somewhere else in external data, there is no way for the investigator to do oversight. So I think, to me, those are non-risk. And what we don't need to forget, and we did not talk about it yet today, is it goes also beyond with the feasibility assessment. We all do feasibility assessment at a study, country, on site level, and we know about it. and that feasibility need to feed into your risk mitigation. If you know you are having an umbrella and there is a risk of unblinding, you need to have a mitigation plan like a safety net or a firewall, so teams are not exposed potentially to the unblinding. And at the end, to me, you have two kinds of risk. You have the avoidable risk and the unavoidable. So if you have an umbrella design, it's unavoidable. You have a risk of unblinding, you need to do something. And as Ken said, is if you do your risk assessment and you view that you have too many complex secondary and tertiary assessment, you can simplify your protocol and therefore de-risk. Now the topic of today really is what about the risk you cannot anticipate, like a disruption? So it's not in your risk assessment, and the only way to prevent or to reduce the impact of the disruption when it happens is really to have a quality process by design. So it should be infuse quality into your process at the outset. And I will give an example of what I mean in a second. One thing which is critical to understand, and it has been a quest at SCDM, is we want to ensure data quality, but some people don't even understand what data quality is exactly. People are often confused between data integrity and data quality. And if you read, and it's too small, sorry, but if you read the GXP regulation, so from MHRA 2018, the GXP data integrity guidance, they clearly state that data control for data integrity do not guarantee data quality. Really, data integrity is about, is the data managed the right way? Do I have an audit trail? Do I use a validated system? Is my data ALCO attributable, legible, etc.? And it's really focusing on the flow, on the process, the transformation. And when you look at the data quality, it's about, is the data credible, reliable? Can I make conclusion out of that data? And if you think about the evolution of E6, the first release 1996, patient safety data integrity. 2016, patient safety, reliability of the trial results. Can we make decisions based on the data we have? And if you think about disruption, assessing the impact to integrity is different than assessing the impact on quality. One is about, for example, I have an earthquake, the site is destroyed. I know I'm losing all my source data. I cannot do SDV, I cannot guarantee, if I have an inspection, I have no way to prove that data anymore. That's, integrity. And if my data is biased, because I'm introducing other way of collecting data, it's more about data quality. I mentioned that FDA released a good guidance in September 2023 about managing studies in the context of health emergencies. It's talk about natural disaster, but also military conflicts, about infectious outbreak and terrorist attacks. And what is interesting to me is, what if, so we have seen many things in the last few years, right? COVID, the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel, an earthquake in Turkey, January, an earthquake in Japan. Global warming and here and not going away. So is it really unexpected or emergencies becoming the norm? Shouldn't we have a process now by design preventing, allowing us to manage crises when they come? We have been in a reactive mode all the time. And now it's probably time to change the paradigm and focus on what we can do. So you can't read it. Okay, maybe you can here. I cannot read there, sorry. So what I'm trying to highlight is each crisis is different. So if you think about three scenarios, a natural disaster, a military conflict, and COVID. On those three examples, I use this earthquake in Turkey, the war in Ukraine, and COVID-19. And they're all different. And that's why a risk based on one is useful and one size fits all does not work. I'll start by a natural disaster. Give me a few highlights. It tends to be local. The earthquake, it's a country or maybe at the border, two countries. When a disaster hit, in the next couple of days and weeks, you can have a real impact assessment of what happened. Usually it's one event, it's gone, right? So you can have a mitigation plan right away. When you have a military conflict like the war in Ukraine, it tends to be regional. It started with Russia and Ukraine, expanded to the neighbor countries, impacting Belarus, Georgia as an example. Some patients left Ukraine and went to Georgia, Belarus on sites. So patients had to change sites along the way. In that context, it started in 2022. We don't know when it's going to end. We have no idea when the war in Ukraine is going to end. And for all the patients, but not just the patients, because about our site personnel, about our sponsor personnel, they're also affected by that conflict. So when you think about a mitigation plan, you need to consider site, patients, your own personnel, the logistics of the drug. Like with the war in Ukraine, the border of Russia got closed. No way to send IP to Russia, right? So I think all the factors are different, but you can think about how, if it happens, what you would do. And that's what we have learned a lot for the last 3 years about what we should do. But now it's time to put it into a process and make it effective. COVID, I'll give you one interesting example. Long time, the world was affected in different intensity and timing, right? And we didn't know the end when it started. But it also can have an impact beyond obvious study, but about a business model. So, you know, data management was not in the past a very sexy discipline. A lot of the DM folks got offshored to low-cost location, right? So we went to India, to China, you name it. And the model was the following. You have a big facility, a big floor plan, desktop, and hundreds of people go to the office. 8 hours later, they leave. 100 people come again. 8 hours later, they leave. 100 people come again. But what happened when COVID hit? Building lockdown. Nobody could access any single desktop. People did not have any laptop. They did not even have internet at home for some of them. So in one day, because that city was locked down, works shut down immediately. So it's an example of disruption that if you don't pre-plan, your business model does not work. So when you think about quality by design, you need to consider the study, but also your operating model. Because what we're seeing, and it's really my topic today, is being a DCT, being complex protocol, we throw it at as a study team, enjoy, and we don't design a process to try to make it simpler to them. So on my last slide is some opportunities, some of the learnings we had. So what you can do is to assess the impact of a disruption, you need data. So we define a series of KRI, rate of missing critical data, dropout rate, rate of missing IMP, etc. So we have now a database, cross-study. So if there is an issue in one country, I can look at all the sites in that country and see if I have a lot of missing data, missing IMP, lost to follow-up, deaths, etc. So I can right away assess what the situation is about. And I'll go back and I'll explain further later. On these sites, you don't know what you don't know. So in the case of an emergency, sites could be operational. So war in Ukraine, it started in the Russian-Ukraine border. Sites closer to the other side of Ukraine were not impacted originally. So some sites were working, some sites were not. Some sites were partially working. For example, site coordinator left with their husband. So that minimum staff coverage, but they had coverage. So they were partially operational. Some sites, you had no clue, we could not even reach out to them. So you have to know the context of the site to take action. If they are not reachable, don't bother as a data manager trying to call them to ask for anything about your study. They are not reachable, or if they are totally non-operational is the same thing. My last 2 points is data integrity. So you can assess impact on data integrity. So if the last site is destroyed, you can quantify that missed SDV, missed percentage of missing data, etc. With one caveat. Typically, in a study, it takes 5 days from the time of visit of the patient to entry into the ECRF, right? In the case of a disruption, what we have noticed is it takes much longer. So now if you look at data and you say, okay, today, if I look at my data, I have, let's say, 70% of missing data in the affected sites. I look at the week after, it may be 60. And you can see there is a big and longer lag between the ability of the site to provide us information because they have priorities. In the case of a conflict, first they have to be safe. They have to treat patients. The last thing they want to do is generate queries and enter data in the ECRF. But when you want to use the dashboard to do oversight, if you too simplistically interpret an indicator, it could overinflate the situation. So I think you have to be careful. One of the learning is really establishing the right risk indicator and monitoring them with a critical approach. When it comes to the last piece on data quality, impact on the meaning of the data, value, reliability. So, and again, it depends on the situation. I go to the war in Ukraine again. So if you have few sites in Ukraine on the study, on many sites everywhere around the world, you can statistically, and we have statistical tool, compare data from everybody on Ukraine separately and see if you have different data pattern on the 2 data sets. And you can assess if there is an impact on your data. And you don't always need a statistician to do that. So there is solution out there. But in COVID, every single site was affected. So you have no comparator. It was before COVID, after COVID. So what I mean is basically each scenario is different. And if we want to have a very robust quality by design process, we need to consider all of those factors and design a resilient process where the team can say, I have this scenario, and they can push a button and trigger an action plan. So and I think it's not just about leaving the team to manage risk, it's also ensuring the process itself is catering for a robust remediation in case of emergency. So that's why I believe RBM and crisis management goes very well together. You can have a predefined approach to managing the risk in the case of a disruption. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. You know, I think your case studies, like highlighting the disruptions, are so interesting because I think we hear again, you need to consider the risks of each study as unique. Each study is unique, but each disaster has sort of unique risks that it presents as well, and sort of underscores the importance of a quality by design approach in RBQM. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Michael Walega for our last presentation. Oh, you know what? This mic fell down on the ground.
There's got to be some drama, right? Sorry about that. Well, that shouldn't matter. I'd like to echo what you've heard today and the value of this workshop. I know I've taken copious notes, and I've heard some great observations by colleagues already that are here. And in some of them, I'm actually going to refer to them here in this presentation, so it's good that I'm sort of going towards the end of this, because I think there's a lot of tie-ins. And so if I happen to go a little over, I will keep my eye on that. I do apologize. But I'm here to represent the PHUSE consortium, and it is my great privilege and pleasure to represent some of the work a specific working group, the RBQM working group, has been doing over the past couple of years. And I'd like to think that what you'll hear today from myself, you'll see the tie-ins to what we've already learned and heard from really valuable speakers and their insights and what we've seen in the presentations. So moving forward from there, There we go. So a couple topics, really just a brief introduction to FHUSE. If you're interested in joining, please let me know. Then moving on to the key topic of why I'm here, which is to talk about the risks and challenges and successes that we may be seeing with RBQM in the industry coming out of this working group. And then lastly, to talk a little bit about maybe some reflections. So FHUSE has been around since 2004. It is an industry consortium, public industry consortium, primarily focused on statistical programming, data, the techie kind of stuff, but RBQM has managed to become a part of this, and I think a really important part, because FHUSE also has elements of data standards. Maybe there's a connection there. The open source and data visualization, which we know is really critical to helping us with tools and understanding how to utilize and operationalize RBQM. The RBQM working group has been around since 2021. It is the newest working group. It consists of individuals from FDA, from sponsor side, from service providers, and also from vendors. And so it's a rich group and mix of individuals who are participating in this working group. And this working group is comprised today of 3 ongoing projects that I've listed here. And we've got some deliverables. And one of the deliverables, actually 2 of them, I'd like to sort of bring to this workshop is sort of the value that it brings in bringing this conversation forward within the industry. And one other point is the FHUSE has been around for long. They have a plethora of ways of communicating to us as an industry, either through conferences that they hold or through webinars or through LinkedIn. There's a lot of different ways. So again, I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, please take a look at the FHUSE website. So, adoption of RBQM, successes and challenges. I know Ken has talked a bit about this. I know Nicole has talked about this. You know, what is the pulse of the industry? Where are we as an industry in really understanding how we're doing in terms of implementation, and what can we learn from this? And so one of the teams in the RBQM working group in FHUSE decided to conduct a survey. Surveys are very popular. But it helps us to understand directionally where we want to go. And as the RBQM working group moves forward this year, that, and in addition to some things that we've heard here today, can help us think about, well, where do we want to go in terms of new projects? What can we do? How can we help the industry become better versed, more adept at this process we call RBQM? And so while the sample size wasn't necessarily large, it was very informative in terms of some of the consistency and maybe some of the inconsistencies that we saw coming from some of the respondents. And so we asked a lot of questions. It was a 30-question survey. In hindsight, maybe a little bit too big, but we thought it was valuable to really understand directionally what are we seeing in the industry. And one of the first questions we asked was, well, and if you're trying to apply RBQM to your clinical trial development programs, where do you see the most successes and what in terms of the applicability? And one of the things we saw was that there's a strong desire and ongoing implementation in the industry, but as Ken noted, we have work to do, and that's fine. This is a journey for us. This is a methodology that many organizations, they have to take that first step forward and understand, what am I going to get out of this? And I think how we measure that, we have some opportunities to really consider. And what we saw that certainly if we think of quality tolerance limits, which is one of the key elements of the 3 projects that are ongoing within the RBQM working group, we saw that there was a large focus on late phase trials. You have the data. You have the understanding. You may have the historical knowledge of trials that you could then build off of. And you see less of that in earlier phase trials. And again, that's not necessarily not intuitive. It's something we anecdotally have been aware of, that it's more challenging. How do I design a parameter and then a threshold to evaluate something important in earlier phase trials? And perhaps with E6R3, where there's a potential to move towards something called acceptable ranges, we may see that. I believe that the idea of measuring something at the trial level is important. It can help us better manage our trials and make them more effective and more efficient. But we still see the challenges of implementing things like quality tolerance limits earlier on in the drug development program. We also asked about the use of quality tolerance limits and how they're governed. You know, if we heard earlier today that it's important in terms of assigning these things or aligning these with our QMS system. And we think that that was an important avenue that we actually were able to explore. And what we saw that it was encouraging to see that many organizations are taking steps to formalize this, but again, we see that there are opportunities. And one of the comments that Moke made earlier about senior leadership, I'll call it senior leadership buy-in, we see here in the data that's shared here, that there's maybe a larger opportunity to really engage our leadership, because people look to our leaders to understand, well, if this is important to you, then it will be important to me. And how do we do that? How do we ensure we have a robust framework for, I don't want to call it governance, but engagement with our senior leadership, where they communicate to us on a continual basis, this is important. This is how we bring value. This is how we bring these therapies to the people that need them more rapidly, with higher reliability in the data, such that regulators are inclined to agree with what they're seeing. So we really think this is an important step to the implementation of RBQM, but we also recognize that even within here, and we see, for example, that quality tolerance limits, they're pretty easily applied, but we still know we have more work to do. And I think, again, part of this is putting into a more robust framework for how we can make this business as usual, really. We also asked about, well, if you have challenges, and this is really one of the challenges, where do you see them? Do you see them in trial design, in the size of the trial, or in the phase of the trial? And again, not unexpectedly, in the middle is our quality tolerance limits. They're more challenging to implement on trials that have less data, or maybe earlier in their development phases. It's a phase 1 trial, a first-in-human trial, a clin-pharm trial. How do you go about doing that? And there's still, I think, is a lot of opportunity as an industry to consider what is the best way to assure that we have our eyes on these trials and can move these forward in a way that we meet the goals of the particular trials. We also noted that there was impact on the overall implementation of quality by design, or I should say less impact, because of it's a process. The implementation of quality by design is a process. The implementation of identification of CTQs is a process. The implementation of how we respond to and how we communicate to deviations, important deviations from the tolerance limits. Those are all processes that, in theory, should be really devoid of impact from the size of the trial, the phase of the trial, et cetera. So there's a lot of, I'd say, consistencies here in some of the information that we've seen, with also things that we've seen, whether it's from, again, from Nicole or from Ken, what Ken has presented earlier. We also looked at, and I think this is two important elements here. On the left-hand side, we asked, well, what parameters do you use? And again, fairly generic, fairly general, but again, directional, and I think that's important. So on the left-hand side, we asked, well, what are the parameters that you focus on to assign a parameter for quality tolerance limits? And on the right-hand side, we asked a question, which again gets back to something that Ken had said earlier about, well, what do you think about this? What do you see as the perceived value of quality tolerance limits? And what we were really buoyed to see on the left-hand side of the slide is, in the majority of cases, the respondents look to apply either the primary objectives, efficacy objectives, or the safety objectives to the trial, or the secondary objectives. And that's important. In addition to that, on the far right-hand side of that graph are the subject matter experts. And again, if we think about it, that makes sense, because if you're focusing on a protocol level objective, key objective, you want those individuals to contribute to, well, where was this important? Is it the statistician saying, well, if we have X amount of early dropouts, then I lose power in the trial? That's important to me. Is it the clinician who says, well, if I have a certain number of loss to follow-up, that's important to me because I can't provide additional clarity around the benefit of this therapy to those that need it? So we found that to be confirming to our suspicions that this is what organizations are doing. They're focusing on what really matters, the data that matter, which are the objectives. The right-hand side was a bit of a head-scratcher because we didn't anticipate this. We thought, well, quality tolerance limits, they've been around for a while, and yet what we were seeing was, well, maybe the perceived value of them isn't quite there yet. And there may be a number of reasons for this. Is it, again, because it's the historical data? Did they really identify what was systemic in nature? Was it really systemic? Were they able to do a really robust root cause analysis to get down to that, to understand if it was systemic or not? What does it indicate that the use of these parameters and tolerance limits must meld and join in with really robust risk mitigation strategies, and maybe they weren't working as well. So we found this was a fairly simple question we thought to ask and didn't really get what we thought we were going to get as far as a response. I think it offers some insights into perhaps what we need to think about as we move forward with this idea of tracking and observing information at the study level so we can be better at this. And as noted earlier, this ties into what Ken had said earlier about what is the perceived value of tolerance limits. Again, I would have expected that number to be substantially higher than what we saw, and maybe there are some similarities here. Just moving briefly into some work one of the other teams has done on threshold identification. We know this has been a challenge for the industry. We see this at whether at conferences or in webinars where subject matter experts are really trying to help the industry better identify these thresholds. And we do it today typically through statistical means. And so what they did was to try to focus on those methods and parameters to help the industry, and they've published a paper, soon to be formally published, that I believe will help us provide more information, a richer approach to having a dialogue about how do we do this effectively. And it does highlight that there are some challenges here. And just briefly, to focus on one that's near and dear to my heart as a statistician, it's how do you measure this? And again, well, if I have enough data, in theory, I can measure this. If I have some historical knowledge, I can measure this. And is it that we don't necessarily have the right models in place, that we're not using the right framework for this? So it's helping provide the industry with that guidance. Transcelerate has done this already in providing guidance around tolerance limits. I think that's a very valuable place to look. And so I think there's a lot more we can do. The definition of thresholds by subject matter experts, again, that ties back into some of the previous information that we saw coming from the results from this survey about those individuals are really important. But do they understand really how to do this in an effective manner, in a repeatable manner, a consistent manner? And then lastly, to talk briefly about, well, how do you manage your deviations? What do you do? What are the mitigation strategies to put in place for managing deviations? And again, varied responses that we saw. The desire to actually conduct an amendment or put amendment in place, we found to be very interesting. That's to me suggests that is a systemic thing. That whatever was identified was systemic in nature, which sort of doesn't agree with the perceived value question that we asked on slide 10. Not quite sure what that means. Maybe we need more data to understand that. But they seem to be not necessarily aligned with each other in how we interpreted that. The whole idea that we believe that because of this, there's a strong root cause analysis framework that many companies have in place. I know I think, Leslie, you talked about continuous improvement. We saw a lot of that. We saw at least 70% of the respondents said they have a feedback framework in place. Now, that could mean just at the trial level, which it's a start, but it's not necessarily where you want to be. You want to be really at an enterprise level so you can really mine the value of this information that we are collecting about our ability to conduct trials. And similarly, the idea of providing, on the right-hand side of the slide, vendors and sites with more instruction. I worry about this because training is not necessarily always the best sort of approach to putting in a corrective, I'll call it a corrective action, an action where you expect to see a change in something. It can be viewed as very ambiguous, can be viewed as very loose. It's not like putting in a more rigorous control in place, but that's harder because we know in clinical trials, and I think Moak made this comment earlier, who conduct the clinical trials? We do. And so we make mistakes. We're under pressure. We're under timelines. We have other things we need to do, and yet we still have to manage trials, and we think of our partners at our sites, where they're managing 10, 20, 30, 40 trials at a pace, and whose trial is this? I was talking to one of my colleagues during lunch. How many trials are they managing? How do we know that this is being done in an effective and consistent manner? Are they making mistakes because they're confusing one trial with another? So there's a lot of, I think, opportunities where we can do more, but I'm not convinced that the idea of doing this in this way as far as providing more instruction to sites is really the most valuable. But again, I think there's more we can glean from some of the information that we've gotten. So just briefly, first, thank you again for this opportunity. Just some brief reflections on what we've seen, and there may be portent of work to come. Clearly, we see that the framework for RBQM is moving forward. We see the industry is adopting. We're really delighted to see, as a working group, that the industry is embracing a lot of these tenets and expanding them, not in phase 3 trials, the large phase 3 trials, but into other trials. And that's really an important step forward. We're really happy to see that there's apparently more alignment between quality by design, critical to quality, how you measure that in a metric of some kind now today is perhaps key risk, quality tolerance limits and parameters, and also key risk indicators. We know that they're aligning their QTLs with C2Q and quality by design as part of RBQM, and we saw some of that in some of the data. And lastly, that we also recognize that this is still a work in progress. And one of the things we'd like to do is perhaps in a couple of years, maybe next year, is resend this out and see where we are. And perhaps a little refined, but to see where we are in terms of next steps. And then lastly, some acknowledgments for those that made this presentation possible. And lastly, thank you to you for all of what you've done to really make this very valuable for myself and I think for a lot of us. So with that, I'll turn that back over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Michael. All right. That was really interesting. I think it was interesting to see how the ACRO and the FHUSE data sort of really complement each other really well, so I appreciate that. And before we jump into the Q&A session, I'm going to give a few minutes for our other panelists to give some opening remarks and maybe some reflections. So we'll just go down the line here, and we'll start with you, Steve.
Presentations. Again, I'm privileged to be here as well. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel and discussion. It's exciting times right now. We've been at this as an industry for at least 10 years now, or more. Actually, probably more than that, going back to even before 2010. And there's a tremendous amount of progress that's been made. So I'm personally really excited to see how much progress that we've made. I'm going to just, as Michael was talking about before, echo some of the thoughts that were made so well earlier today, in the discussions earlier today. We're on the RBM side of the discussion right now, but one of the things I'd just like to point out that I think is probably an opportunity more than a reality today in terms of the connection between quality by design and RBM, RBQM, is really connecting the two pragmatically, linking them pragmatically to leverage. What's at the core of both is risk assessment and mitigation, right? So that's the whole umbrella here is risk-based quality management. You're doing a risk assessment as part of quality by design to guide an optimal trial design. The team that's doing that, ideally, should be documenting that process, and that should be done in a way that the team that is responsible for operationalizing that protocol has access to the full outcome of that risk assessment, so that when they repeat the risk assessment as part of study planning, which many of our organizations hopefully are already doing, that you're not reinventing the wheel, that you're learning from what your colleagues that were involved in the design of study have already thought about. So I thought it was perfectly stated earlier by many of the speakers that this entire paradigm, all it's for and all the specific methodologies and tools, it's really fundamentally all about providing just a framework to encourage all of us to think before we act, right? And I don't want to be too repetitive because I know that was brought up before, but it's such an important component. We tend to get tied up in all of the mechanisms, and I think David and others were saying earlier, just simply over-engineering. We as humans tend to like to over-engineer and overcomplicate things. So just to add a little flavor from my perspective to that, things like the pre-study risk planning. We've seen, I think less and less, I think people are getting better and better at it, but putting too much emphasis on the specific scoring mechanisms of each risk, and colleagues arguing too much at length about whether this deserves a score of 3 or a score of 2 on probability or likelihood on a given risk, right? And you're wasting time and you're losing the real point of it. The point of the whole exercise is to get cross-functional experts together to brainstorm and really think, what can go wrong with my trial? And then decide together, what can we do about it? The tools and the processes around that, they're helpful, but there's been a real tendency and a threat, as probably many of you in your organizations have seen in one form or another, of just getting caught up in the checkbox process, losing sight of what the importance of, and just getting so tied up in the details of the process. Always remember what it is we're trying to, what's fundamentally, what are we trying to do? We're trying to encourage thinking before we act and focusing on what matters most in the clinical trial. In terms of the study conduct piece, I want to just point out that it's been mentioned several times today, earlier by, was it Fergus who mentioned the importance of central monitoring, also Michael and others. But I just want to reinforce that it is really at the core of the operational oversight component of successful risk-based monitoring, is that you have effective centralized monitoring. It doesn't mean site monitoring isn't important anymore. It doesn't mean clinical data management reviews aren't important anymore. But central monitoring is a key weapon, and I think we should more and more be thinking, as many organizations are, that's at the core. That's sort of a central hub of quality oversight. And along those lines, I think what we've achieved with RBQM and RBM is, of course, this move away from what someone mentioned earlier. We've spent literally billions of dollars over the last few decades on quality oversight methods like 100% SDV, intensive boil the ocean data review. And evidence has been produced. People increasingly realize that it's extremely expensive, time intensive, and to a large degree, some of those methods have missed the point, right? It's like missing the forest for the trees. We're so focused on individual trees that we're missing. And what we mean by that is what really matters most from a quality risk perspective is systemic issues in the conduct of your trial, right? It's, at the end of the day, it's about the reliability of the data, but the data is generated from the conduct of the study. So what you're really monitoring, and what central monitoring techniques are so good at, more so than any other traditional techniques we've had, is identifying systemic issues in conduct, which by their nature are potentially much more impactful than the individual, this blood pressure was out of range, or this site forgot to transcribe this value correctly from source to EDC, and I picked that up via SDV. I'm not saying we should fully get rid of those, but they should be much more targeted. And what we really should be looking for is things that are systemically wrong. And you can see that in data, as Nicole was mentioning, in an aggregated way when you're looking smartly across all of your data. So, KRIs are, of course, everyone is hopefully using key risk indicators, primarily focused at the site level. Statistical data monitoring, we've seen is also a very important component. And I'll differentiate. I think of two types of central monitoring techniques. One is sort of supervised monitoring. That's where I've designed a key risk indicator for a specific risk of interest that I've pre-identified, and I'm going to monitor that. Then there's sort of an unsupervised approach you can take, which is this statistical data monitoring that you're applying across all of your clinical data in a somewhat unsupervised way that helps to expose potential systemic risks that you may not have anticipated in a pre-study risk assessment, or maybe partially you have, and it was just better than some of the KRIs you imagined at helping to expose the problem. What we've done some analyses actually on hundreds of clinical trials, and we found that organizations using both of those methods together side by side, close to 40% of all of the issues, confirmed issues found, are from that unsupervised statistical data monitoring. The other 60% being from the KRIs, the QTLs, the supervised type of monitoring. So just wanted to reinforce the importance of having a full suite of capabilities. And again, just making sure that you have an effective central monitoring component. By the way, and along those lines with systemic risk, I see one of the things that is important for organizations, everyone in the organization to recognize, is the distinction between monitoring study conduct, which is, in my view, what central monitoring is really doing. You're using data to monitor it, and yes, at the end of the day, but you're really monitoring the quality of the conduct of the study. Whereas I would say, and not fully, but clinical data management reviews, data cleaning reviews, tend to be less focused on study conduct and more on data accountability, transactional data cleaning, where there are transcription errors, things like that. So it's not an all or nothing, one or the other, but I think it's a really important distinction that some people, don't have a full appreciation of, and it's a really important thing to understand about what we're trying to do with improved quality oversight. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I'll pass it on to Kristin.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks everyone for the awesome presentations today and up here as well. It's been, I've been in RBQM for 10 years, and I'm still writing furiously and thinking about, as someone who's in operations, how can I take this back and apply it on the actual trials, at the ground. So a few trends that I've heard today that I think are really important for making the difference between it turning into a checkbox activity, which we've heard over and over is not what we want, and instead getting the meaning that we want out of the processes. One is what this conference is all about, really, is focusing on what matters. And I think there's a tendency to focus on that at the beginning and then kind of let that thread drop, whereas we have to be really hyper-vigilant about just keeping that thread from the beginning of the trial all the way through the end. And it's easy if we don't change our processes. So if all of the functional areas aren't changing something, then we're for sure going back to what we were doing before. So I think it's important to actually make those changes, make things more cross-functional, make sure we're all looking at the same playbook on what's important in that trial. The other is bringing the right people together. So this is one of those things that's easier said than done. I think we see here that the magic happens when we're all probably in the hallway or at lunch, bouncing ideas off of each other, having those conversations where you can see that the collective mind is better than those individual minds. So making sure that we're not doing these things asynchronously, but we are bringing everyone together. And I know for anyone who's facilitated one of these meetings, there are often some awkward silences at the beginning of them as we try to elicit people to really put their critical thinking caps on and have those conversations. But it's worth it, because once you see that start to happen, the results are incredible. And then the third thing is just, I think someone mentioned it before, but it's worth underlining those lessons learned and the feedback loop that I think Mike mentioned as well, and making sure that that's in place from trial to trial at the enterprise level, and also from those disruptive events that we have to be able to anticipate, like Patrick was talking about, and we shouldn't be recreating the wheel every time. And with all of these, they're deceptive because they seem so common sense and it almost seems easy, but it requires that attention throughout to make sure we're constantly redirecting ourselves to what matters, And so it is an effort, but of course it's worth it since we're bringing better healthcare to humanity, and there's not much that's more important than that, I think. So those are my reflections, but thanks again for having me here in such a great conference. I'm looking forward to the Q&A right now.
Thanks, Kristin, and thank you to all of the panelists and presenters. It's been awesome. Just a quick reminder that there's the QR code. So if you wanted to put any questions, or you can visit slido.com. Of course, we also have the microphones here for those of you who are here in person. And while the questions are starting to come in, I'll kick off with a question. A theme that came up during a few of the presentations this morning and this afternoon was that the uptake of that initial QbD approach, and including initial and ongoing risk assessment, seems to be fairly well adopted, but there sort of remains a lag in integrating and implementing risk-based sponsor oversight and monitoring. So what risk-based monitoring and oversight strategies can really help to ensure that risks to critical data and processes are properly monitored and managed? And also, I think, how do we accelerate the adoption of these? And these have been touched on through a lot of the presentations, and I'm looking at you, Nicole, because you're sitting right next to me, so I'm going to start with you.
So, thank you. I think one of the biggest things that we can do to accelerate adoption is, to Steve's point, around education. I think there's a misunderstanding about what central monitoring is, for example, what value sometimes it brings. I know initially back 10 years ago, it was often said, I heard a lot, we don't need central monitoring, the study is small. Or there's only 5 patients per site. I don't need, central monitoring. And if you think about it in terms of just the data that's collected for that single patient, so just one patient, if there's 7 different data sources and 100,000 data points for that one patient, central monitoring of trending and pulling and aggregating that data together, even for that one patient, is important. And it's something that can be done way more efficiently in a central monitoring capacity than traditional monitoring and sending CRAs out to the site, because CRAs are not going to catch the stuff that we can see through aggregated data. They're just not going to do it. And I think taking the time to sort of explain that and all the different ways of doing it. It's not just a one way of executing. And I think that that's an important part to consider.
Absolutely. Anybody else want to comment on that?
No, I can if you want. On the adoption of quality by design, so we can spend the entire day just on that. There is something we can do, and we should do it. So it starts by leadership modeling and advocating. So as an example, we can change the processes to embed risk-based methodology. As an example, we changed our SOP to mandate to do data validation only on critical data. We don't data validate non-critical data anymore. We have to demystify what a risk-based is, and many people, they think a risk-based approach is taking risk. The meaning of the regulation is the opposite. It's really focusing on what matters so we can secure what is most important instead of spreading our resources and focus everywhere. So people have to understand that a risk-based approach is reducing and not generating risk. And that's a big confusion. And going back to the education piece, it starts by that, actually. And I think, to me, as we discussed, we need to have processes specific to each function. Because when we talk to a statistician, they will have a different interpretation about the QTL. And we could debate if QTL are necessary for early studies or not. I think Transcelerate was advocated not to have QTL on a short duration study, because the idea was if you exceed the threshold of the QTL, it's a systemic and you need to act. But what if it's a short duration study, you have one cohort, you enroll all patients in 1 week, even if you detect it, it's too late, it's gone, it's over. So if you apply a fit for purpose, it does not fit. That's why it's really the culture, I think, that needs to be changed, but from the top.
Yeah, just want to add on the how do we increase adoption, and I think forums like this are really important for getting together and really talking about where are we, use cases, what's sharing what we think are best practices, that kind of thing. So that's certainly a help to hopefully prompt more organizations to jump in the pool and get going. But I'll just reiterate again, keep it simple. Over-engineering gets in the way of successful adoption, I think, a little bit too much. And besides the risk planning, I'll just throw in even things like the site monitoring strategy, the SDV, SDR strategy. Sometimes people tend to over-engineer. It should be thoughtful, but make it simple for the site monitors to implement. Make it, rather than coming up with all sorts of different algorithms for the amount of SDV that you're going to do. I'm definitely in the camp of a very aggressive reduction in SDV and SDR. And I know that some organizations are even talking about completely eliminating SDV, maybe not SDR, but keep it simple. QTLs is another great topic. My colleagues in my company have taken to calling me Captain QTL because I've been such an evangelist of it. I was thinking of wearing a cape and a mask here today with a QTL on the middle. But to me, actually, the real fundamental value of QTLs now being in ICH regulations, more than anything, is to reinforce the importance of monitoring for critical risks at a systemic study level. So whether you call them QTLs, whether you call them study level KRIs or something else, it's a reinforcing that systemic risk there's nothing more important than monitoring for that. So.
Can I just jump in? So one of the things that, on reflection, and it was Janet that said this earlier today, and it's truth. The whole notion of quality by design, critical to quality tolerance limits comes from manufacturing. Anybody here come from manufacturing? Raise your hand. I won't be able to see it, but all right, so we have a couple people, all right? But my point is, it's the language of those who are in manufacturing. This is what they do day in and day out. I think, Leslie, you talked about that. It's what they do day in and day out. They're very familiar with this. You try and move that into the clinical trial continuum, the ecosystem of clinical trial. What? Equality by what? So I think, to your point, see, part of it, and we've heard this, part of this is education, but I think it's a different kind of education. Because E8R1 talks about quality by design. And it's almost like, and this is my interpretation of PHUSE, is there's an assumption that, well, you know what that means and what to do with that. And I'd say, no, I don't think as an industry, and perhaps some of the things that we saw from the PHUSE survey and from what Ken has shared and others, maybe there's more work need to do there on the fundamentals of, do we really understand what this is and how we operationalize it? Because I think that's part of the challenges we're seeing in this operationalization is, well, what is it? How do I move this forward? And how do I move this forward in a way that it becomes part of a flywheel? That way just keep doing and becomes business as usual.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's interesting because you think about all of these terms and qualities embedded in all of them, and it's RBQM, and it's RBM, and it's QbD, and it's, it becomes a little bit of a word salad, to use a phrase of a colleague of mine. And I think really kind of getting to the fundamentals and making sure people really understand what we're talking about when we talk about, these approaches and implementation. Thank you all. So we have a question that I think it's been maybe brought up a few times online from the audience, and this is maybe relevant to me as well, but I'm going to start with our panelists. What has been the panel's experience regarding inspections when using RBQM? And if this was brought up this morning as well, I think as maybe a fear or something that could create sort of some backpedaling would be if you were cited on a 483, for example, on non-critical, something related to that we wouldn't consider to be critical to quality. So I don't know if anybody can speak from experience.
I'm happy to start. So I've had the opportunity to work across two large global CROs and then a smaller CRO. So I've had an opportunity to work in an RBM space since 2006, probably across, personally, maybe 400, 500 studies. Many of those have gone through inspections. And I will say not a single one was cited for any kind of risk-based monitoring strategy in all of that time frame. I will say what the two things that I've seen is, number one, I've seen failure to respond to risks that were identified in the data fast enough. So that has been an issue. And I think to Leslie's point around action, like if you find something, like what's your action, and showing that you've tied that together. So I think having that in place is really critical. And then the only other thing that I've seen in all of that time around inspections is that a monitoring plan was not in place until, or a finalized monitoring plan was not in place until like 6 months after the first patient was enrolled. And this was way back in one of the very early studies. And the reason that that monitoring plan was delayed was because the teams could not decide on what the monitoring strategy would be. And so I think it is important for organizations that are going to develop a risk-based monitoring strategy that you at least have a plan, an outline, a standard, if you will, that can be flexible for every study, because you don't want to run into that, where you're still arguing about what your strategy is going to be, and you're changing it, and before you know it, a patient's 6 months in and you're still trying to figure out what your SDR/SDV strategy is going to be. So I think those are the two things that I've seen from a standpoint of actually measuring audit findings. So any audits or inspections that were either performed by our team internally, by sponsors, or by inspectors, we would measure. And what we found over quarter was like a 14 to 16% decrease in critical and major audit findings in studies that used RBM compared to ones that did not. And you might think, wow, if you're using reduced SDR and SDV and you're not looking at all the data, how in the world are you doing that? Well, critical and major audit findings are not about transcription error. They're about things that matter. So it's things like, was the patient consented appropriately? Were they eligible for enrollment in the study? Were the endpoints measured and collected appropriately? And were adverse events collected and reported appropriately? And you don't have to do 100% SDR and SDV to assess systematically at each site whether or not they have a process in place that can generate quality data and patient safety. You can take a sampling approach. And I think the data in the inspection success has shown that it works.
And in fact, 100% SDV and SDR very often won't find those those type of systemic
because
errors.
We're worried about transcription,
because you're looking only one patient at a time.
And not about eligibility and
Right.
yeah,
the important thing.
Because my experience with inspections has been that, like, explaining the risk-based approach and having that in place, but then also kind of to echo what Nicole, you said, is when you identify those risks and you also identify and document those mitigations, that they're actually being done. So, and then if you identify the issues and the actions, that you're getting to the root cause of that and addressing it at the highest level that you can, and not just addressing it at maybe the data point level or that particular site level. So I think it's what I've seen that comes up, I think appropriately, is that follow through all the way to resolution.
Great, excellent. Well, that's really helpful to hear. I think that we try to focus on the critical data. That's our goal, is to focus on critical processes and data, but just as we keep talking about adoption and learning, this is learning for us as well, right? And I think having clearly documented risk assessments and risk monitoring plans we talk a lot about thinking, and it's all about thinking, but we want to know what you're thinking, and having that thinking really clearly documented is really important. And it's good to hear that 14 to 16% reduction. And I don't know how much of it is fear versus a reality of sort of irrelevant citations on a 483. Something that maybe we can try to dig into, but I think it's an interesting question. So I did want to just touch really quickly on a topic that we haven't really touched on too much explicitly yet today. But there's, I think, a lot of interest at the agency. We recognize this proliferation of third-party vendors and conducting, clinical trial activities. And we're very interested in oversight of those third-party providers. And so I guess the question is really, how should sponsors incorporate a risk-based approach to quality oversight of service providers? What approaches should be taken? What is working? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or feedback on that. Go ahead, Kristin.
I can start. I think taking a risk-based approach is really looking at what is being outsourced, right? And if it is something that matches up to those critical to quality factors that were identified, then you need to have the same level of oversight over that. So, and if it's something that isn't on that list, then you can have a lower level of oversight. But at the highest level, I think being very involved in that, like understanding what the processes are, understanding what the outcomes are, reviewing to the point where you can see if that critical thinking is happening. So those are my thoughts there.
I come from a sponsor background, and so I might be a little biased in my perspective from the sponsor side of things, but I think aspects of risk-based monitoring, it's critical for the sponsor to be as closely involved as possible in the risk planning process. I think it's great, the CROs should as well. It shouldn't be one or the other. I think they should be working together, but what I always advise is if you're a sponsor, do everything you can to be involved in that process up front. I mean, it's your clinical trial. You have experts on the clinical trial. It's your trial. Work with the CRO in terms of that risk planning. Be side by side with them in terms of defining what are the risks, and even looking at and maybe contributing to the risk mitigation strategy. If you can. I mean, it's not a one or all, but it's just, to me, that's a general guidance. And then during the course of the trial, same thing with the quality oversight. I mean, frankly, all of this, the central monitoring tools we now have, the data analytics, getting data closer to real time, the sponsor alongside the CRO has the opportunity now to regularly and proactively get a window into what's going on in the trial. So just a general encouragement that the sponsors, even if you don't have the bandwidth to own all of those functions, that's why you have the CRO partner. I think with a fairly limited investment of resource, you can still take advantage of RBQM and still be closely involved in it.
One thing that I noticed during COVID was in working with one of our sponsors, we had to adapt to more central monitoring capabilities, obviously, than on-site monitoring. And this was in an oncology trial, and the sponsor came to me and said, I'm really nervous that we don't have anything to show our oversight. I know you guys have been doing central monitoring, but what I'm missing are those MVRs of those on-site visits that showed you were, in a summary, all of the deviations detected at a site and all of the queries and sort of where that site stood. And I said, we've actually been providing you central monitoring reports for every site on the trial. And it was their team just didn't know what to do with them. They were expecting a monitoring visit report for an on-site visit, and we had what looked very much like one, but for central monitoring. And they just did not have any realization that that was the evidence. And that they, and once they saw that, they were absolutely astonished and felt, they said they could sleep much better at night, knowing that there was such robust oversight of the data in the patients in particular through the central monitoring that was occurring. So I would advise everyone to really understand the process, the systems, the new reporting, care about the process that is happening, and get to know what the actual details of that process are. I think just as you would do a qualification audit of a CRO, for example, in how do you train your employees and how do you conduct on-site monitoring visits? I think there's a lack of understanding fundamentally about central monitoring, of asking the questions on what kind of reporting will I get, and I think there's an expansion of that still needs to happen in the industry. Be careful not to over-question, like you don't need to know how the algorithms necessarily work, I would say. Sometimes there have been, some, and Steve can probably attest to this from a technology vendor, CluePoints, you don't know how your cell phone works, but you know it works, and you trust it and you use it, and that kind of thing. And I think that in some level, from a central monitoring perspective, there has to be a little bit of trust there. Don't slow the process and the adoption down by questioning every single KRI and its, fine-tuning. Keep in mind it's the big picture.
Well, so you mentioned, sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
Is your question about how do we apply risk-based oversight of our vendor, or how do we oversee the risk-based implementation of the vendor? What is your question exactly?
How do, the first.
The first.
Yeah.
No, because to me, it's a risk-based approach, right? Because all vendors are different. Because we have vendors providing services, or provider providing technologies like a Nicole, an IVR. We have providers like a reading center, acquiring images and data on doing reading. So each vendor is different, and you need to apply a very tailored approach to each vendor. And even if you think about a CRO, I can give you a pragmatic example. Big pharma, we tend to do merger and acquisition. So when you acquire a small company, they tend to have restricted budget. They tend to go to smaller CROs who don't have massive technology and infrastructure. So you probably need to have a higher level of oversight and engagement than if you partner with a large CRO like yours. And I think you really need to understand the risk associated with each vendor, each data stream, and tailor it. For example, on the context of a smaller CRO from merger and acquisition, using a statistical tool, you don't need to do it every day, but maybe once or twice during the course of the study, you can analyze the data to see if you see any pattern data anomaly that would grant further assessment. But I think you really need to tailor specifically to each situation, and it goes back to E8. It's fit for purpose, critical thinking, because every case is quite different, and we have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, actually.
Yeah, and I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question, and I apologize. I have a couple. This question's been asked a couple times.
Do you want to go then? It sounds like you might have something more. We only got a minute and 3 seconds left.
Right. So this is. So I'm gonna
Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. So this has been asked a couple times, and your mention of algorithms sort of keyed me into this as well, and that's AI, and sort of the future, and whether what the role of AI is or may be in the future in this space. And we've got time for a few sound bites.
I think the possibilities are limited only by our imagination, but I think we need to be careful in what we do with that information. We have so much data, and that could all speak to whether it's de-risking a protocol, whether it's the kind of data we use, the kind of parameters we use. We could build out models that could help us build all of that together. But to me, what it doesn't remove is the context we have in our own brains and experiences of the conduct of the trial. That they haven't figured out, although Elon Musk has figured out how to tap into that. I think that's one important thing that we just have to not lose sight of.
Yeah, and maybe we are out of time. If you have 1 minute, is on AI. Now, on the model is to me, it's going to change fundamentally the way we work, from being reactive to predictive. It may not be AI, but today, and we have started pilot, we can start predicting, as an example, the rate of AI reporting, the rate of missing data. So we could potentially predict things before they happen, which means the concept of I have data, I generate a query, I act, is no longer applicable anymore. I have data based on historical data I'm predicting, so I need more analyzing the root cause of what could happen but did not happen yet.
Yeah.
So the paradigm shift is humongous on the process end-to-end because we're assessing hypotheses, not analyzing facts and data, and that is big.
And I'm going to give you 15 seconds, Steve.
15 seconds. So, no, I just want to add that, of course, we're heavily investing in machine learning and AI, just as a lot of organizations are. But I just want to add, we're already having success. We're already applying it to very real use cases in risk, to improve data management processes and to improve risk detection. And we'll continue to make incremental progress. Everyone who's in machine learning at some level knows you need labeled data for machine learning, and that sometimes is a limitation, and sometimes that's, and it's very use case dependent, but there's a tremendous amount of opportunity.
Absolutely.
All right, well,
Thank you.
thank you. With that, thank you to the presenters and panelists and to the audience. I think we cut the break down to 9 minutes maybe, but have a good afternoon.